Hello, everyone. My name is Christina Hervin. Today, we're going to briefly go over the DSM and how to navigate this text. The DSM refers to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and the DSM was first published in 1952. So since then, there have been several updates to the DSM. So if you'll notice, the most obvious immediate change would be the shift from using Roman numerals to numbers. The fifth edition of the DSM was released in May 2013, and updates to the 2013 DSM-5 featured a new text revised copy. The DSM-5 text revision was released in March 2022. There wasn't enough updates to change the DSM to a new edition like DSM 5.1 or DSM 6. So the DSM-5-TR has been updated with at least 70 disorders getting new criteria and new context to describe each of the disorders. The only new diagnosis found in the text revision is prolonged grief disorder. And it took about 2.5 years for experts and leading researchers in the field to provide this addition. Updates, revisions to the DSM typically occur every 10 to 15 years. The DSM is widely used by health professionals to diagnose psychiatric disorders. So if I had a room full of health professionals like a psychiatrist, a social worker, counselor, psychologist, and a client was receiving a thorough assessment, each health professional should come to the same conclusion about the disorder that that specific client should be diagnosed with. So it does help us to provide a common language. And then once we have an accurate diagnosis, we then can figure out the best course of treatment. Previous editions of the DSM featured DSM codes or numbers to represent each disorder. There are no DSM codes in DSM-5-TR, only ICD-10-CM. And ICD codes were established to provide a universal and global classification system of diseases. The ICD system was created by the World Health Organization. The US decided to modify that version of the ICD and came up with the ICD-10-CM. And this is used by the US Center for Disease Control and Prevention's National Center for Health Statistics. So this provides the only permissible diagnostic codes for mental disorders for clinical use here in the US. So ICD-10-CM stands for International Classification of Diseases, and we're currently in the 10th edition, and the CM refers to clinical modification. In the US, the use of these ICD-10-CM codes for disorders in the DSM-5-TR, they've been mandated, and this is how clinicians get reimbursed by insurance companies. So clinicians would share a billable ICD-10-CM code to the insurance company to get paid for those services. So if you open your DSM and flip to the Roman numerals, you'll find the DSM-TR classification system. Most disorders in DSM-5-TR have an alphanumeric ICD-10-CM code that appears directly next to the disorder. You'll see this code next to subtypes and specifiers. If you look at this picture here of the DSM, you'll see that there's a page number in parentheses. So if you wanted to learn more about trauma and stress-related disorders, you would just go to page 295. The ICD-10-CM codes, this number here, so F43.10, this is what you would share with insurance companies to get reimbursed for services. So if you flip to page 113 in your DSM to follow along, I've copied over the picture of the diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia. So we'll review schizophrenia, and at the very top of page 113, you'll see the name of the disorder. You'll see the ICD 10-CM code of F20.9. And then you'll see a list of criterion. As you read through each criterion, you'll notice that for part A, at least two criterion in A's symptoms, they must be present for at least 1 month or longer. To be diagnosed with schizophrenia, at least one of the symptoms must be present of delusions, hallucinations, or disorganized speech. Disorganized body movements and catatonic behaviors, that's something that may also be present, but it's not a requirement to be diagnosed with schizophrenia. And then go over to part B. So for criterion B, impairment is present in one or more area of functioning. So an individual has difficulties with work or school, relationships, or just even general self-care and hygiene. Symptoms must be present for at least 6 months with criterion C. And then if you go to section D, you'll notice that we can rule out other disorders. And we rule out these other disorders like bipolar disorder by noting that schizophrenia requires the presence of delusions and hallucinations. So as you can see, the criteria section is quite lengthy. So it's really important for you to read through each of the criterion for the disorder and then review the specifier information. So if you look here just on page 115, you'll see that there are unique specifiers for each psychological disorder. And in addition to the specifiers, you'll also be able to rate the severity of a disorder. So for some disorders, it may present as mild or moderate or severe. Other important specifiers to know is remission. So a client may experience remission for a disorder or the absence of symptoms. And it's still helpful for us to know the client's history of experiencing a specific disorder, even if they are in remission. So adding that remission specifier, whether it's partial or full, will help with the treatment process. So to be diagnosed with a disorder like schizophrenia, it requires a constellation of symptoms or a required length of time to meet the criteria. And you'll see the similar format for all the other disorders found within the DSM. So in addition to the actual criteria for the disorder, you'll see a lot of additional contextual information. So go ahead and turn to page 26 in your DSM. So on this page, it provides a summary of each of the sections listed for each disorder. Each section features information about the prevalence of a disorder. So for instance, like how common is schizophrenia or how common is major depressive disorder? There's a section devoted to cultural considerations. So you'll notice in the DSM-5-TR, the language has shifted to reflect certain cultural groups with the language that we use today. And other cultural considerations to think about if you turn to page 17 in your textbook, you'll see a subsection that shares more about the impact of racism and discrimination on a psychiatric diagnosis. So cultural considerations are important before we take that step in diagnosing a person. We'll see what disorders are likely to co-occur which is also known as comorbidity. And as you flip through a couple of the different criteria for disorders, you'll start to see some similarities or overlap. And with each section, there's a differential diagnosis section, which really helps us to differentiate two disorders that sometimes may look very similar with their symptom presentation. So take a look at each of these headers. So you'll see primarily most of these for each disorder found in the DSM. And each disorder was studied, researched, and went through like a pretty rigorous process by the leading experts in our field to come up with this current information that we use today. So now if you flip to the end of the DSM, you'll see a section devoted to assessment measures. So throughout the semester, we will review several of the cross-cutting symptom measures, which really help us to pinpoint the symptoms of specific disorders. Assessments allow us to gather baseline data, to recognize symptoms, and to track progress. Another chapter to note in our DSM is the Culture and Psychiatric Diagnosis section. And this provides helpful cultural and social contextual information that we would want to know before we make a clinical diagnosis. Within this section, you'll also see the cultural formulation interview. This is a helpful assessment tool to help us learn more about a person's culture and how their culture may impact the symptom presentation, or also impact the type of care or treatment they'll receive. So the cultural formulation interview, it's helpful to use for all clients, really for us to get a better understanding of their cultural identity and experiences. Another section you'll notice in the back of the DSM is the alternative DSM model for personality disorders. So this provides information on how else to assess personality disorders. If you flip to the personality section in our DSM, the leading experts acknowledge that there are some limitations with how we identify the symptoms of a personality disorder. So this section provides an alternative of how else we can assess personality disorders. So lastly, there's a section devoted for further study. So as we've discussed, a lot of work went into the research and development of disorders. Some of the disorders found in this section, they do require further research, further study. So currently, there's not enough evidence or support to classify these disorders in the actual DSM. Stay tuned in later editions of the DSM to learn if any of these disorders found in the further study section will become an official psychological disorder. The only addition of a disorder found from DSM-5 to DSM-5-TR was the addition of prolonged grief disorder. So the additions found in DSM-5-TR just provided changes to the language and the contextual information for each disorder.